And you're live.
Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to the shop. Tonight we are going to be talking about saws, from the big frame saws and the massive crosscut saws all the way down to the little dovetail saws. And I want to be talking about all sorts of different things about them, from what makes a crosscut to a rip cut, what different things with the set, what are different things with types and size, and as well whatever questions you have. So if you're watching this live, go ahead and throw your questions in the chat and we will get to them as many as we can. If you put a super chat up there, then we will jump to that for sure. But also, if you are watching this recorded, then if you look down in the description below, I'm going to have a list of timestamps, and those will get you roughly to where it is in the video where I have that question, so you can actually read down through the questions ahead of time. So we'll be sprinkling the questions in throughout the talk today. So first I want to actually talk about different types of saws and their different uses. Not like rip or crosscut, but different saw styles. So first off, one of the big questions I have is the difference between a frame saw and a bow saw. Now, every bow saw is a frame saw. It has a frame that holds it together. But not every frame saw is a bow saw. So in this case, this is not a bow saw. The blade, the bars are what are putting the tension onto it. And then the tension is being pulled on the blade itself. Whereas with this, there's actually a string on the back, and this is what is being put into tension so that the blade is also in tension. So you have one stretcher with a bowstring on the back and a blade on the other. So that's why this is a bow saw, but this is a frame saw. But this is also a frame saw because it's made with a frame. So that confuses a lot of people. But you get into all different types of that, so you have things from like the big Roubeau style to this is more of a continental style framing saw. You store them loose and you show them off live. This is a continental style saw, and so this would be where the joinery style. So most continental Europeans would use a saw like this anytime a lot of the English style will use a back saw. Then you've got a bucksaw. This has a crosscut teeth, and the bucksaw is also a bow saw. This is for cross-cutting large logs and things like that. I'll use this for my big breakdown because it cross-cuts incredibly fast. The teeth on it are like 4 or 5 PPI cross-cut teeth. So this rips through a board incredibly fast. You'll see me do this a lot of time when I have boards that I just need to rough cut to length and do them quickly. That munches through them. But most commonly you'll see it for cross-cutting logs. Then you've got more delicate things, like the turning saw. The turning saw is also a bow saw. It's got the string on the back, the frame on it, and this is for more delicate things where you want to actually curve into it. So basically anything you would do with a small bandsaw, a small bladed bandsaw, is what a turning saw does. And then you can go down even farther into your coping and your fret saws, which are technically a frame saw because there's a frame around the blade. But they're not a bow saw because there isn't another string on it. The blade is what is actually being tensioned. So I don't know if I've ever heard anyone call them a frame saw, but technically they are a frame saw. These are for a lot of your really small detail cuts. Anything with the turning saw where you just need a little bit more delicate hand to it, that is where a coping saw or a fret saw comes in. Yes, so that is most of the frame and bow saws. Next up, we're going to then get into the other saws. This one is a crosscut saw, which is kind of confusing because any tooth that has a crosscut pattern is a crosscut saw, but this is a crosscut saw. So if you're talking about something with the big name crosscut saw, that's this. It has teeth that are designed for cutting across logs. Much like the buck saw, this will do the exact same thing, but this does it a lot bigger, a lot faster, a lot heavier. So if you're cutting through large logs, this is what you want. Whereas the buck saw is more for smaller logs in that diameter. So then we can come down to the hand saw. Now this is where it gets confusing because everything I've mentioned so far and all of these over here, people call these hand saws. They call these hand saws. This is a hand saw. Everything else here is not a hand saw. A hand saw is a panel saw that is at least 26 inches. Some people will draw the line at 24 inches. But most commonly, it's got to be at least 26 inches from the tip to the heel, toe to heel. And then it becomes a hand saw. Most commonly, hand saws have a rip cut pattern, so they're intended for ripping down the board. And they have generally large teeth, like 4 or 5 PPI. So we'll get back to that in a little bit later. Slide that over there. We're making a mess here. Then we can come down to a panel saw, which looks a lot like the hand saw, but you can see it's a lot smaller. Usually they're around 24 inches in length, sometimes a little bit smaller than that, sometimes down to like an 18, 16 inch range. And they come in a variety of teeth. You can get them with a crosscut, you can get them with a rip cut, you can get them with small teeth, you can get them with big teeth. Some of them will have a back on that will actually come out about that far. That's called a half back. I don't have any of those. They're kind of like the jack saw. They're great at they can do anything, but they're kind of like not great at any one particular job. So then we can move down into our back saws. Back saws are any saw with a back on it. And so this is a stiffener. What this allows it to do is allows you to get a thinner plate. So if you get a thinner plate, you get a thinner kerf. It makes it easier to push. But with a thinner blade, if you're pushing it, it wants to kink and bend on you. And so with that, we have a back that goes onto it, and that holds it stiff so you can cut down and have a little bit of control with that. This is a tenon saw. A tenon saw is designed for cutting down the cheeks of the tenon. So you need to make deep cuts with the board. So you're going to be ripping the board, going down the grain this way. And this allows you to get down into the board a long ways. It's fairly deep. And a tenon saw is a good all-around saw, but it's one I don't use that often. Next up, you have the sash saw. And a sash saw is a little bit smaller than a tenon saw, commonly known as a sash saw because it does the window sashes. It is a saw that is kind of in between. I rarely ever use my sash saw. Number one, it's really not a great saw. But number two, it's just kind of that in between. It could do anything, but it's not really great at anything. And so that brings me to the most commonly used saw in the entire shop. For most hand tool woodworkers, it's either the sash saw if you like the big saw, or it's the carcass saw. A carcass saw has cross-cut teeth, so it's intended for cutting across the board. And this is the most commonly used saw because it's for joinery. You cut across the board, and it's a fairly thin, it's not very deep, it gives you a lot of control, and so because of that, it is something that allows you to get right on the line and get really accurate stuff. It's not big, but it's a nice saw to have.
So you have a super chat.
Let me just do this and I'll get right back to you.
Okay.
And then last we get down to the dovetail saw. And for some reason this is what people think is the first saw that they need to get. And in all honesty, I use most of these saws more than I use a dovetail saw. And a lot of times it's the one I'm going to tell people, hold off on it. It usually has a rip cut tooth because it's designed for cutting down the board, but it doesn't cut down very deep. The plate is not very deep. There isn't much space up to the blade. It's very, very fine. It cuts a really nice clean line, but basically the only time you need to cut a rip down a little ways is if you're making finger joints or dovetail joints. And so in that case, you don't really use it that much unless you're going to be doing a lot of dovetails. So that's a quick run through of all the saws. I'm skipping over the Japanese style saws because I'm horrible at pronouncing the names, and it's not something I'm as affluent in, so I'm not as good into those. But a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about follow into Japanese saws. It's the same methodology and the same system, big tooth, small tooth, and how it all goes together. So I'm going to be getting to rip saw and crosscut in a minute, but we got a super chat. What is it?
Yes. So Shawn OBrien asked, can you explain how to measure a saw's PPI in order to buy the proper sized files for sharpening?
Yes. I will actually talk about that here in a moment, but I'm going to bump the heads. You gave a super chat, so we're going to jump straight to that. So normally I would actually go into crosscut versus rip cut, so I'm going to do that in a minute. So if you're waiting on that, I'll come to it. But first I'm going to go to, here it is. I'm going to switch over here to this. And I love that new transition. We got a new toy over here. But on this, you can see down in this corner, as long as I can get my camera out here, down in this corner here, we've got a little 5 written in here. It's kind of hard to see. Let me actually see if I can get that in there. No, I'm not going to be able to get a focus on that. Tiny little 5 right here. And that is stamped in a lot of the older saws, which is the PPI or TPI. So the number of teeth per inch. Points per inch and teeth per inch talk about the same thing, but they talk about it differently. Points per inch means if you have from point to point is 1 inch, then that means that there are 5 points in that. Whereas TPI would be 4 points in it, would be 4 teeth. So you would have 4 whole teeth, or you would have 5 points in an inch. So a 5 PPI is equal to a 4 TPI. Basically, the smaller the number, the bigger the tooth. So in this case, there are 5 points per inch, which makes it a 5 PPI saw. Switch back over to this one. And then we get up to this one. This one has 2 points and about 3 inches. Excuse me, about 4 points and 3 inches. So this would be like a, what? No, it would be, yeah, like 1.3 PPI. So big teeth, small number. Then I get down to dovetail saws. And dovetail saws, this one is, I want to say this one's 18 PPI. My little dovetail saw here. Oop. Focus on that, focus, there we go. Hey, look, you can see a reflection there. Isn't that nice? So I believe this one is 18 PPI.
No, you're on
Oops,
the
sorry.
right
Oh, I can
camera.
get that one.
Oh, we're stuttery.
There we go.
There we go.
So I believe this one is 18 PPI. Tiny teeth, that means 18 in an inch. Now, the question then comes, what saw do you use where? In general, the bigger the tooth, the faster the saw cuts. The smaller the tooth, the cleaner the saw cuts. And so it really depends on where do you need to be in that space. With a big handsaw like this, has ripped teeth, I want to cut this board down. I want to get through it quick because I got to go through 100 inches of board. I want big teeth. They're going to munch through it. But that big tooth means it's not going to leave me as clean of a cut. I'm going to have to come back and plane it up later. But I can get down here to this dovetail saw. This thing cuts slower than a snail on Saturday, but it does it really clean. I mean, the lines I get off of this are just butter smooth. I don't have to touch them up with anything. This gives me a cut that is gorgeous because the teeth are smaller. They don't scratch up the side as much. Now, that isn't the total of the story because you also have set. Set is, so imagine you have all of the teeth on the saw are sticking up. Set is every other tooth goes out of alignment. And let me actually switch over to this. So if every other tooth comes out of alignment like this, the more set you have on the plate, the farther the teeth stick out on the sides. The less set, the more they come in. Less set means that you're going to have a cleaner cut. You're also going to get a finer, you're going to be cutting less material out, so it's a little easier to push. More set means that you're going to have a less clean cut. It's going to be scratching up the side of the wood as it comes by. You're also going to be cutting out a bigger curve. So with that, a lot of people immediately think, ooh, I should have less set. The problem is the less set that you have on the saw, the more the saw will bind, the more the wood can pinch the blade. Because you want to cut a kerf that is wider than your plate so it doesn't bind up and grab the plate. And so it is a balance between how much set do you put in and how big of a tooth. And that's one of the big reasons why you have so many saws is there's so many different compilations of those. My handsaw has big teeth and has a decent amount of set because it has a very tall plate. I don't want the blade pinching up on it, so I want some more set on there. I want big teeth because I want to cut through the wood very quickly. I come here to my carcass saw. This is crosscut teeth. And I don't have much set on this at all. I have very, very little set on this because when I'm cutting a joint, I want to have a nice clean line. And my teeth are a little bit smaller. What is the PPI on this one? I want to say it's like 12 PPI, I think. Nope, 14 PPI. It's up on this one. And so on this one, I've got relatively small teeth. And this one's actually printed up here, 14 PPI. With very, very little set. So this is going to give me a very clean cut. It's a very thin plate. And this is going to give me a very detailed cut. It's still going to be a little faster than my dovetail saw because the teeth are still a little bit bigger. But it is still going to give me that clean jointability, so I know that right off the saw this will work for me. So what questions we got before I move on?
Well, you owe Shawn a dad joke.
Oh, I do. Do you have one? Do you have a mom joke, or should I come up with one?
Okay, hang on.
I could tell one that the kids told me the other day.
Oh, I want to hear the one the kids said then.
Arthur comes up to me and says, "Dad, why did the bus go honk?"
Why?
Because someone pushed the button. Good one, boy. Good one. What do you got?
That is Arthur. Oh, you want my joke too? He gets double.
Yeah, why not?
All right.
Sean's a good guy.
Okay, what do dentists call their X-rays?
What's that?
Toothpicks. Toothpicks?
Oh.
Did I seriously have to explain that?
Oh, he who laughs last usually had to have it explained.
All right, it sounds like they might be hearing some feedback, and I know it's the headphones, but I don't know.
No, you'll be hearing feedback tonight. We're trying out new equipment, as you may have seen. I have this switcher, so we get this nice clean fade back and forth. We also have 2 lapel mics.
I know.
But I think I'm talking loud enough you're actually picking up Sarah's mic.
Yeah.
You're picking up my voice on Sarah's lapel mic. So I'm still working on isolating those. But if you turn yours off, then it'd just be a simple one. If you want to talk, you can bring it up, but I don't know if that's too much for you. Or
Well, if I just turn mine down a little bit.
sounds good.
Okay.
I also need to change the settings on yours a bit. So yeah, we're playing with new things, and if you like this new switcher, let me know, because I'm playing with some new ideas, and this has some other things we can add in. Makes it a lot better than those color bars. Yay! What questions we got?
Okay, hang on. I was just gonna. Sarah needs push to talk. Oh.
Oh yeah.
All right. Oh, I forgot to time mark that question. Oops. Let's see. Harold Golden had asked, can you also talk about dealing with kinks or dents in the saw plate?
Okay, let me get to that. So here, I'm going to put a bend in this. Right now, this saw plate is really pretty straight. It's got an ever so slight bend, maybe like a 1/16 of an inch out from one side to the other. Let me switch over to this one. So this one, you can see, is pretty darn straight. So I'm actually going to put a bend into this one. Oh no, he's going to bend his saw, and I'm actually going to pull this tip all the way back to there. And it's still not enough. Good spring steel requires a lot to get a good bend in it. There we go. Now we got a good bend in this. So let me show you what this one looks like. See if I can get this there. All right, see how that's bending way out that way? Now we're going to get rid of that. So if it's a simple bend like that, and you see that gradual curve, you bend it back the other way. And then you eyeball it. That was actually a little bit too far. There, now we got it back. So now it's back to straight. See how that goes? So that's a curve, and a lot of people are really afraid of it, but you really got to bend that thing over. A lot of times you got to make the toe touch the handle, and you're going to eyeball down it. You're going to see if the bend is in the middle or out at the end, and wherever that bend naturally is, you want it to be in the center of what you're actually bending out. And so for most bends, that's all you have to do to fix it. These come back and forth really easily. And a lot of people are really afraid of bending it too far. Don't worry about that. Bend it over. It's spring steel. It's designed to take a lot of force before it causes any problem. Now, if you have a kink is where there's a sudden bend. It's not a continuous bend over the whole plate or even over a section of the plate. It's actually a point at which the plate bends sharply. And if you have a kink, for most saws, it's trash. In most cases, it's just not worth saving because the amount of work it takes is very, very difficult. The way you take a kink out is you get a hammer and an anvil, and you set it on the anvil, and you slowly tap it out. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be stretching one side of the plate, and actually, because what's happened is the steel has stretched on one side and it's compressed on the other. And so you want to reverse that by stretching the other side and compressing the other one. And you do that through a hammer and anvil. And it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of patience. And if you do it wrong in any way, you've got a kink you will never fix. So it takes a lot of skill to do that. And so that's why in most cases, if there's a kink, it's just not worth saving the saw. For instance, I actually have my tenon saw. I'll show you this. This is something I did a while ago, and you can see there's actually a kink here.
Can you
What's that?
focus?
Am I not focused? Sorry.
Smidge.
There's that better?
Yes. Thank you.
So I actually have a kink up here in the plate. It should be rounded like that, and I broke that off. And what happened is I pulled it out of the cut, and I went to go back forward, and my hand went out, and the tip caught in, and I bent it over. And so I have about 2 inches out here in the saw that I'm never going to be able to bend back into perfectly straight. And so usually when I use it, I just stop short, and I never let it go into that last 2 inches of the saw. And so it's one of these sad things about this that I would love to one of these days replace it, but there's basically no way I'm going to be able to fix that and get it completely usable. Yes, I could take this apart, pull out the plate, and go to town on it, but it's just not worth that. So yeah, most of the time kink means trash, bend means bend it back. Now if you do have a bend in a back saw, let me show you one of these. So this one, yes, this is my Atkins. So this is an Atkins steel back saw, and a lot of people kind of poo-poo steel backs. Steel backs are actually, I much prefer them over brass backs in their functionality. They are stiffer, they are stronger, they are lighter. They just tend to be a better back. But people kind of poo-poo them because brass looks better and brass is what's there. But a lot of American-made saws have steel backs. So if your back saw has a crimped or folded back, like this one does, and you can actually see how it is a piece that has been wrapped around and folded. Let me actually show you this one or this one. This is one of the early ones from Bearcat, and you can see how the back is flat on here. This actually had a channel cut out of it rather than folding the brass around to pinch the plate. So most of the time I don't really like this, but for a small dovetail saw it's not an issue. He has since gone to working with folded brass. Or the Veritas have this encapsulated thing. It's not a folded back, but it's still holding it stiff. So if you have a folded back and your plate has a curve, what you want to do is hit that back on the bench top. So you can actually come in here and you want to actually hit the whole thing flat on the back. And so this is going to be a little loud, but it comes down like that. And what that's going to do is actually reseat the plate down into that folded back. And this will keep it stiff. So if there's a bend, it's usually because some portion of the blade is pushing forward out of the back and the other sections are still holding back. Hitting it down on the bench knocks the whole plate down in there and will actually straighten it out and give you a nice clean straight cut. So I hope that answers your question about straightening and stiffing. Any questions right now?
Yes, I don't know if you've answered some of them.
Okay.
But, let's see. Tom West asks, is a reverse teeth saw a dough saw?
A reverse saw?
A dough saw?
I think that's supposed to be a joke.
Oh, I don't know.
But I don't know. Probably want to have to explain. So I don't know what you're talking about then.
All right. Let's see. Harold Golden had asked, do you use the bucksaw on the pull or push stroke?
A bucksaw actually does not have, well, some people will put some rake into it. Most bucksaws don't have any rake at all. So the points are actually straight down. So you cut both on the push and the pull stroke. And the nice thing about that is it's very efficient, very fast. The downside to it is no matter what you're doing, you're scratching it up and making a rough cut. So it's always going to leave you a much rougher cut. But with the bucksaw, you usually want the teeth aiming straight down. Speaking of which, let's actually talk a little bit about crosscut versus rip cut. Crosscut, if you imagine having two marking knives. So in crosscut, you have these knives. Let me actually zoom in a little bit more. Focus, there we go. So you have these knives that come to a point here. And these two have the bevel on the same size, but with a crosscut saw, you're going to flip it around and you're going to have one with a bevel on one side, one with a bevel on the other side. So you imagine these being nickers or spurs on a plane is what you have in a crosscut saw. So let me grab my actual crosscut saw, and here you can see it's got big teeth here, and you can see how this one has a bevel on this side, and this one has the bevel on the other side. And so with this is going to score one side of the cut, and this is going to score the other side of the cut. And because you're making big cuts, it actually has rakers that come in and clean out. So this cuts one side of the board, and that cuts the other side of the board. So, for example, here, let me do this. So, for example, I'm going to grab this board here. One knife is going to come through and cut one side of the mark, and the other knife is going to come through and cut the other side. So this would be the width of the cut coming through here. And so with a crosscut, you have these knives that are severing the fibers, and then with a big crosscut saw, you actually have another chisel that comes through and pairs that out. And then the next two teeth come through and they cut those lines a little deeper, and the chisel comes through and takes it out. And the next two cut through a little deeper. And with this has the exact same thing, just they're very, very, very small. And so if you imagine each of these teeth being a slightly different knife, you have each one of them coming through and slicing the fibers. One on one side, one on the other side, one on one side, one on the other side. And it will slowly work its way through the blade, slicing through all the fibers. Now, a rip cut saw is more like a chisel than a knife. A rip cut saw, if you take chisels, it would be going down the length of the board. So let's actually come back over to this. Get these out of the way. And with a rip cut saw, we want to actually go with the grain. And so in this case, if I came through with a knife, it's not really going to do much because the fibers of the wood are already going that way. But if I came through with a chisel, I could actually grab this one, and I could come in here, and I can cut in, and I can pare out these little curls. Except for it's not going to work really well because I'm digging in. I'm going against the grain right here. Let's come back here where I'd be going with the grain. There. And so each blade comes through and takes out a curl. So if you imagine all these chisels being in line, they're all coming through here, and each chisel, it's taking out a little curl, and that one's taking out a little curl behind it. That is what a rip saw is. And the way you achieve that is by using the file. So back up a little bit. With a rip cut saw, the file goes straight across the blade. So if you imagine, you're actually sharpening the face of the chisel. With a crosscut saw, it goes at an angle. So you can imagine it sharpening one of the two bevels on the knife. So that's the difference between rip cut, and crosscut. And I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I have an entire video dedicated to this where I go into it far more deeply. But that's really kind of confusing for a few people. Got that. Cool. What's the next question we got?
Well, Tom West gave us a super chat for a poor attempt at a joke with the bucksaw and dough saw, which I got.
Oh, bucksaw, dough saw. He who laughs last. Yeah.
But Tom had another question, so I'll ask his question. And I don't know if you answered this one earlier either. What do you think about the smaller coping saws that have the girded frames? They are red, I think.
Ooh, the new connection, nuke. Oh, someone will put it in the chat what the name of the company is. Yeah, they're kind of cool. They're a little bit gimmicky, but they do feel really nice in the hand. They're a little bit stiffer. They hold things a little bit cleaner. And so if you're doing a lot with a coping saw or fret saw, they do make it nice. They are very nice. But when you compare the price of, $15 new to $100 new, if you're not going to use it that often, it's really not that big a deal. But if you use it a lot, it does feel better. And sometimes that feel is very important. So they are very nice. But I don't have one because I don't use it that much. And usually when I need to do fret or coping work, I'm using one of my foot-powered or hand crank. Those tend to be a little more fun.
So everyone's yelling in the chat, new concepts.
New concept.
Okay.
What's the next question?
It's always scary when everyone just starts throwing the same answer out and I'm half paying attention. We have to do a joke for a super chat.
What is it?
Why do people in Athens hate getting up early?
Why?
Because dawn is tough on Greece.
Yes. I like it. I don't remember where was that. Oh yeah, we're going to talk about file sizes. So, when you are sharpening a saw, and if you want any more detail, I have several videos on how to sharpen a rip saw, and I have several videos on how to sharpen a crosscut saw. So I have entire videos where I'll go into this in great detail. But for right now, I'm going to kind of go through it. But if you look down here, I've got a set of files. These ones come from Lee Valley. They are Meko files. At least most of them are Meko files. I replaced a couple of them. And so they even have sizes. They have needle file, 4-inch double slim, 5 double slim, a 6 double slim, a 6 single slim, single X slim, a 6 slim, a 7 slim, 7 regular, mill file. And so they have all of these sizes. And you're going to have a lot of people tell you, ooh, for a 5 PPI, you need to have a 7-inch slim. And you're going to have people telling you, for this size tooth, you need to use this size file. And that's good to know, but it's not as important. And so I want to show you why. What we've got here, and I'm going to clamp this in while I do this. I'm actually going to show a little bit closer up on this so that you can understand the sizing of the file. And I'm using a big tooth because it makes it a little bit clearer to see. Any question while I'm setting this up?
Let's see.
Actually, maybe come down a little lower.
I'm just asking these in order that I found them. So Tom again asked, lowest PPI I have is a 7. It's an awesome saw, but it travels around when I rip cuts. Should I move to a 5 or 4 to solve this problem?
Traveling around when you rip cut probably means that the tooth geometry is wrong, because a crosscut saw tends to follow the grain because you have those knives, whereas a rip cut saw just slides through it. So that's usually the most common problem, is that someone put too much fleam on your rip cut saw. The size of the tooth really isn't going to matter as to moving around. The size of the tooth has to matter with speed and how much material you're removing at any one given time. So let me show you this. So here I've got a close-up on the teeth here, and if I put this file in here, actually come around to this side here. And this one I put in here, and you can see how, let me get my pointer so you can see this a little better. Put this into here. You can see how this tooth comes up on this face. It's not quite up to halfway. It's about 1/3 of the way up through this face. But if I come around to this side over here, zoom down a little bit. Zoom down, wrong term. Camera guys are yelling at me.
Whoa.
Here, let's do this. So if I come around to this side and I put this on here, now, you'll see that? Yeah, I can see it. You can see how this tooth now comes up to right about halfway on this file face. And what's happening is, now I'm going to be wearing on this file from middle down to this point. If this tooth comes up past the middle point, so if I rotate this a little far and try and force it, now it's coming up a little bit past halfway on that file. And the problem with that is now I'm going to be wearing out the middle of this file twice as fast as I'm wearing out the 2 corners. And so I don't want this tooth point to come up past halfway on the file. Because if it comes up past halfway, I'm going to wear out my files twice as fast. And really, that's the only thing you're looking at, is you want to make sure that your tooth does not come up past halfway. You want it to come up close to halfway, but not all the way to halfway. And so if you pick up a file and set it in there, like let me grab this 6 slim, I put that in here, and you can see how the tooth comes all the way up to the corner of the file. Let me grab a mid-grade one. This is a 7 slim, and I put that in here, and the tooth comes up a little bit past halfway. And that lets me know this isn't big enough. I need to grab a bigger file. Or if it just doesn't make it up onto the saw very much at all, you're going to need to get a smaller file. And so that's really the only thing you're looking at when you're trying to pick the size of file to the saw, is how far does the tooth come up onto the face of the file. If it comes up past halfway, you're going to be wearing out your file too fast. So get a bigger file. And really, the only other thing to it is that a smaller file has a smaller corner, because these triangular files are actually 6-sided. Let me switch back over to this. So what you've got here is you have the main face of the file, but on each of these edges, there's actually a flat surface here. And that flat surface makes sure that the bottom of the tooth is rounded or is slightly flat here. That way you don't have a sharp point, so that if it came to an exact point, then this tooth could actually rip down the saw. So having a slightly flat point there, flat surface there, means you're going to get that gullet in the bottom. And the only big difference between a small file and a big file is that a smaller file has a smaller edge. So if you're working with really delicate little dovetail teeth, you want one with a really small edge, because if I use this big one, the corner on this is almost the same size as the teeth I'm using it on. And well, here, let me show you what this looks like. So I've got my tiny little dovetail teeth. Let's see if I can really zoom in on this. Tiny little dovetail teeth. I'm going to grab a file that's too big. And I can put this one in here. You can see it doesn't even come up on the plate. But the gullet is too big on it. And then I can come down here to my little needle file. And this one, that's the file I would use. I don't know if you guys can even see that. But the gullets, the sides on it are smaller, so they'll cut a smaller tooth. And so that's really the only thing you're looking at, is you're looking at how far the tooth comes up on the face of the file. So I hope that answers your questions. What's next?
Let's see. We just got a super chat from Tom West.
Thanks, Tom.
So, okay. He had a question. I got to find it. He said, I have a Speed Corp sharpener guide. Do you think these preset angle guides are beneficial or more harmful? I'm not really a huge fan of saw guides when you're first learning how to sharpen a saw, because they hold the file for you. You may be doing the same action, but you're not really learning all the muscle movement for it. But if you're not intending on learning freehand sawing, then they're great. Can you read his question again? Because I'm getting off track. Okay, hang on. I gotta find it. Do you think preset angle guides are beneficial or more harmful?
They are beneficial in that you will guarantee you get a really nice clean cut. They're a little more harmful in that they don't teach anything. So let me actually grab a couple of mine. So this is when I want to do a video here soon. And this is a guide that will lock onto the saw. And it's a lot of fun to play with. I want to actually clean it up before maybe I'll do a video on showing cleaning up this thing. Here comes the herd of elephants. So I've got this saw file, and so what this will allow me to do is, I don't have any of the angles set on here yet. Have to lift it up. Come on, turn back. Needs a lot of work to clean up. Come on. Oh, it's not going to let me do it right now. I can't open this up. Hey, there we go. Now it's opening. Hey, there we go. Hey, there we go. So you can put a triangular file here between these, and this will hold a specific angle. So as I go across, it's always doing the exact same angle movement. So it's not really teaching me muscle control, but it is always putting the exact same angle in there every time. And this is kind of beneficial. The one I use more often is the Veritas guide that I was looking for. It's disappeared on me. Huh. Veritas actually makes a little guide that clamps onto the other end, and it has a visual reference that tells you what angle you're at. And I really like that one because it becomes very, very easy to see that you're on the right angle, but it's still up to you to make sure you're keeping it on the right angle. And it's really a lot easier than it sounds. And if you're off by a little bit, then you're off by a little bit. Yeah, the saw may not be absolutely perfect, but after using it a few times, that perfection really doesn't matter. It wears through pretty quickly. What's next?
All right. Poor man asked, how would I go about retoothing a saw after I grind all the electro-hardened teeth off?
Yeah, that's retoothing saws is fun. Actually, Paul Sellers has a really good video on it. It's an older one, but it's still really, really good. And I like his method. He has you clamp a board onto it, and then you mark out on that board, and you file into that board on each of those marks. And the board may only be that long, but it has a consistent mark across them. And so you use that, to then clamp it onto your saw plate, and you follow those marks as far as you can, and you're just putting a nick in the top of the blade, getting a starting point for the triangle on every one. And then you take that block and you move it over, and so you're getting that exact same pattern then on the next set of teeth, and you move over again, make that pattern in the next set of teeth. You're just creating the starting point that the triangle sits on, and then you're going to come back through and you're going to spend your time cutting down in that tooth and taking it all the way down to depth. And so, yeah, it's a very time-consuming thing with a lot of reek for hours on end. And it's enjoyable if you like that kind of thing. But definitely look up Paul Seller's retoothing video. That does a really, really good job of it. What's next?
Let's see. Pacific Coast Paper. You may have already answered this. How would you unwarp a plate style saw with a gentle curve along the full length?
A plate style saw. I think you're talking about like a panel saw. In which case I just showed that. So if you go back and watch the video, it's just bending it over.
Yeah, some of these were from a while ago, so
Okay.
you may have.
Cool.
All right. And
Yeah, and just so you know, every saw, this is called a plate. So whether it's a hand saw, a panel saw, a back saw, the actual thing with the teeth in it is called a plate. So, what's next?
well, Nate Long just gave us a super chat,
Hey, Nate, thank you, man.
but he has no question.
Oh, no
At
question?
least not that I see.
Well, at least he gets a mom joke.
I'm getting there. I'm getting
Okay,
there.
she's
I'm
getting
ready. What do you call a cow with a twitch?
Cow with a twitch, what?
Beef jerky.
I like that one.
I knew you would.
What's next?
Okay, hang on.
Oh,
Okay, Mark B. You've always talked about getting a feeling of what sharp is with regard to hand tools. What's a good way to know if a saw is sufficiently sharp if you haven't developed that feel yet?
very good question. Knowing what a good sharp saw feels like is just something you've got to know. And a lot of times that tends to slide off, especially when you're first getting into it, because it's slowly, progressively getting worse. You don't actually feel the difference. But one of the best ways that I can tell people right off the back is you almost never use the last 5 or 6 teeth on the heel of a saw. I mean, on a big hand saw like this, there's just no way for me to get all the way down to it. On a dovetail saw, it's rare because it's down underneath the handle, so you rarely use these teeth. But if you feel those teeth, they're probably still sharp. And if you feel the teeth in the main use, if you feel a big difference between those two, your saw is dull. So that's one of the first ways I'm going to tell people is when you're getting into it. Feel these back teeth and just feel how they catch your finger. Then come up here and feel this one. And this saw is actually probably about 70% gone. So I could probably go and sharpen it because I actually just did a bunch of ripping with it. And so feel these, feel this, and you'll feel a difference. That's one of the ways I'm going to suggest most people. The other thing is if you find yourself pushing and you find yourself just putting force into the saw, either you're getting frustrated, which is often the case, or your saw is dull. A saw, if you are putting force into the saw and you're trying to drive the saw down, then you're doing it wrong. The saw needs to do the work for you. Good sawing does not require a lot of strength. Good sawing just requires the stamina to make the saw go. And it's one of those things that if you can keep up doing it, you can do it all day long. But if you're finding yourself pushing the saw down, you're going to cause all sorts of problems. Speaking of which, if you've ever used a frame saw and you try to do some resawing, you may have noticed a weird phenomenon. If you're cutting down the board, like resawing, well, here, let me go through this. Ripping is cutting the board this way. Cross-cutting is cutting the board this way. Resawing is when you cut the board thin-wise, and you make it 2 thin boards. So if you're resawing, and you have a line on this side of the board, and you have a line on this side of the board, and you're following the line here, and you turn around and you follow the line here, and then once you finally get all the way through, you open it up, and you realize that blade curved inside the board. It's on the line here, it's on the line here, but inside the board it curves out. The reason it does that is either one of two things. One, your blade isn't tight enough. And that's some problem for some people. They just don't crank it down quite enough. Crank it down, there should be a good bit of force on that blade. But two, more common, is that people are forcing the saw. Because when you put force into the saw of a frame saw, you're actually compressing the blade. Because the blade is in tension, so as you push it in, the saw blade gets shorter and it has no place to put that extra kink, and so it puts force on one side or the other inside of the cut, and so you start getting that. And so that's because you are forcing the saw down in. If you let the saw's weight do the work and you just provide the in and out, you get a nice clean straight cut. And so that's one of the big things that a lot of people have had an issue with, is if you find it curving, it's usually because you're getting frustrated and you're really cranking on the saw and trying to get it to do stuff. So what's next? How much time we got? No, we're doing good.
We're doing good. So when you were saying the force, I was thinking, my young Padawan, use the force correctly. Sorry. Where's the next question? Bryan Fulmer. Sorry, answered already. Do you use a saw set on a rip cut or only a cross cut or both?
Saw sets. I didn't talk about that. Well, I talked a little bit about the set of being the in and out. Wait, can you read it? Let me just make sure I understand right.
Do you use a saw set on a rip cut, a cross cut, or both?
You use it on both. Pretty much every saw out there will have teeth on it. Japanese saws, most of them have set. Not all of them have set because they're really, really thin blades and they're trying to get a really clean cut. Or they have an incredibly small amount of set. But any flush cut saw has no set at all. The teeth don't stick out past the plate. That's because if you're flush cutting with something, you don't want the teeth sticking out and scratching the work you're sliding across. But pretty much every saw out there, and specifically any Western saw, has set on all teeth, with the exception of the flush cut. The question is, how much set do you put on the saw? In general, the bigger the tooth, the more set you put. If you are first getting started in woodworking, I generally suggest people set their teeth a little bit more than normal, because what set does is it gives you a little bit more control, because it allows you to scratch the side of what you're cutting so you can use it to steer the saw a bit more. The more set you have on it, the more you can change the course of the saw or change what you have done and use it to more or less file the kerf back into line. But if you have more set on there, it's going to take more work because you're cutting a bigger kerf. You put less set on there, you get a smaller kerf. But if you put in too little, then the blade starts to pinch. And so you're kind of going back and forth in this balance of how much set is enough set. And some people will give you specific numbers in one saw or another, and there are wide ranges of how much set to put in there. But in general, the smaller the saw, the less set. The bigger the saw, the more set. And in most cases, it's very, very little. I mean, it's just a few thousandths, even in some of the biggest sets. Then we can talk about saw setting tools, and there are hundreds of these out there, different styles and different types. They come in all different kinds. So like on this one, make sure that this is in focus. I've got these two here. I've got, 4 or 5. And if you go to any MWTCA meet, when they happen again, you usually find some guy who's selling a bucket of them. And they're usually around $3 to $10 a piece, depending upon their type. But what you have in here, you actually focus. What we have in here is a hammer and an anvil. So in this one, you have an anvil up here, and then you have a hammer back here. And when you squeeze it, that hammer goes forward and presses into the anvil. And so if there's a plate in there, that anvil is actually tilted. See if you can see that up in there. There's an angle to the anvil, and that hammer comes forward and bends that angle in. Now, what determines the size it can be used is that hammer. That bigger hammer can only set a tooth as big as it is. So if it is larger than the tooth, it's going to be crushing down on multiple teeth at once. We don't want that. And so some of them have, like on this one, the hammer is actually, it comes to a point. And so with this one, I can get in on really, really small teeth. And you'll see a lot of these other ones that they were squared off and someone came in and filed it down so it can fit a smaller tooth. A lot of the new ones you find will say they're for like 4 PPI all the way down to 10 PPI. And then you get a fine one that's like 8 PPI all the way down to 20 PPI. And that's usually because you either have a fine one or you have a coarse one, unless you have one that you've detailed yourself that can really do both. If you want a set that can do 20 PPI and 5 PPI, you're probably not going to be very lucky with that. So that's why I have these two set up. This one is for my fine teeth and this one's for my big teeth. I guess if I really wanted to, I could use the fine tooth and do it on all of them, but I don't. And every one of these have different settings and different ways of changing it. Some of them will move the anvil around to change its angle. Like this one actually has a selector on the bottom here that you can rotate. And so this disc here, I can loosen this up and I can rotate the angle, and there's a different bevel on it all the way around. And so whatever bevel I set it on will determine how much set I put into the teeth. And they all have different styles and different methodologies and different functions. And it's crazy how such a simple thing can have so many different settings. But if you don't want to get those, you can always hammer set them, in which case just grab a nail punch or even a nail, set it on a flat piece of wood, and every other tooth come through and just tap, 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 and then flip the saw over, and then do every other tooth in the other way. It's not very accurate because some of them you're going to push a little farther than others. But once you take it out, you can test it and see if the saw starts to curve one way every time. That means that you have too much tooth sticking out on that side and it's cutting more on the other side. It's making it curve that side. And I have an entire video on how to stone a saw, which is the way you fix it, because you can actually take so if the saw is constantly curving this way, that means the teeth on this side are sticking out too far. So if I bring my sharpening stone over here, I can slide it along that side and take some material off of all these teeth that are sticking out this way, and that will straighten up the saw so it cuts a straighter line. And I have an entire video dedicated to stoning the saw if you want to see more about that. What's next?
You shouldn't stone your saws.
My saws are all stoned.
They're all stone. Sorry. Okay. So Nate had a question since he didn't have one earlier through Super Chat, so I'm jumping it up. Okay.
Sweet.
Is it better to set before or after sharpening?
The great debate. Usually I set every 4 to 6 times I sharpen a saw. Because as the teeth are sticking out, if you take off a little bit of material, there's still set on them. There just isn't quite as much set, and you keep going back until there's less and less and less set. And so usually I sharpen every 4 to 6 sharpenings, depending upon how much I'm taking off. So I don't generally consider setting to be a part of sharpening. It's a separate thing that I do occasionally, just like I sharpen saws occasionally. I just set far less than I sharpen. I like to set after sharpening, but in the end it's a personal preference, and you'll find people who will argue up one way and down the other about setting before sharpening and setting after sharpening, and both arguments are really kind of dumb to begin with. But you'll find adamant people who are, you must do it this way. And you look at them and go, oh yeah, okay, good, gotcha. It really doesn't matter. So have fun with it. What's next?
All right. I'm just going to go through these questions. Let's
Okay.
see. Vincent Gurnari asked, is there any benefit to a gents saw handle or just a preference?
A gent saw is, oh shoot, I don't have one. Well, I got a keyhole saw. Yeah, another saw I didn't talk about. Or I could even talk about my my veneer saw. There are hundreds of other types of saws out there. But a gent saw, if you imagine this handle put onto this blade, and so it looks like that. That's a gent saw. And they're very common in dovetail saws. 2 cherries dovetail saw is a gent saw. It's just a different style of it. Usually you only find it in dovetail saws, small detailed saws. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen a gent saw in that. The big difference between a gent saw and like a Japanese Dozuki, which, I mean, it would look pretty much the exact same, except for this cuts on the pole saw, whereas a gent saw still cuts on the push stroke. So, yeah, it really comes down to a personal preference. I don't like it. If I had a really low bench, I think I would like it. But you know, cutting up here with a gent saw just doesn't feel as good. Whereas if I grab this, I mean, you can see how this is far more ergonomic. It's right in with my hand. Whereas with this, it just doesn't feel right. But again, personal preference. Some people really love gent saws, and I still think they're crazy.
Okay, because I don't know if it's supposed to be spelt G-E-N-T, but because it was spelt gent to me, I was thinking like gentleman, masculine.
Well, yeah.
I know, but just how I pictured it in my head.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not the woodworker.
Yeah, it is a little detailed saw. It's a gent saw.
The gent, I like it.
And I've got my Gramercy tools. This is a what's the word I'm looking for?
No idea.
Veneer saw. And so I can actually get different tooth patterns on this one. But this cuts flush up against the surface, so it's kind of like a flush cut saw. Actually, I should probably use it sometime for cutting off dowels flush cut. I have an entire video dedicated to cutting veneer with this. I really kind of like that thing. What's next?
All right, let's see. Tiny Woodshop asked, have you used a jeweler's saw for dovetailing before?
I have not. I have made a jeweler's saws as I've done a lot of jewelry work. Actually made my wife's engagement ring and wedding band. No, I've never done that. One of the more common things is actually to use a hacksaw. Hacksaws actually cut really nice dovetails. I actually have a video showing cutting dovetails with a hacksaw, and they do really good work actually, because they have very fine teeth, not much set, a thin blade, and that's basically what a dovetail saw is. Fine teeth, little to no set, and a thin blade. So hacksaws, great dovetail saws. What's next?
Let's see. Just answered that question. Dennis Meko asks, are there better files and cheap files?
Cheap files, expensive files. I have Meko files, which are really good files. And for a long, long time, I actually used triangular files from the big box store. They work great. They just do not last as long. So yeah, you're spending $5 a file, and you're going to get great saws that file really nicely. You're just not going to get as many sharpenings out of them before they go bad. The Meko files are really good. They last a lot longer, and so they're a little more durable before you have to replace them. So that's really the big difference on how durable you want. But if you're just getting started, don't worry about getting good files. Just get a triangular file that's the right size and go to town. But I like Meko. They're the ones I generally use.
Let's see. So when you pulled out your little saw set thingy-majigger, part of me want to know if that was the last purchase from an MWTCA meet.
This one came from. Oh yeah, this was a. This is at the Peach Meat down in Georgia. Yep. Oh, I had a question here. Actually, it would tile right in. Is it possible to sharpen a dovetail saw with tiny teeth? This is from David. Yes, actually, I have an entire video dedicated to sharpening dovetail saws. And I think I'm going to redo that one because it's a little older video. But yes, you can sharpen them. A dovetail saw generally is just a rip saw with little teeth. So you sharpen it the exact same way you would a rip saw. You just do it with smaller files and smaller teeth. So it just takes a little more detail. Some people like to put a little bit of fleam in the saw. So in other words, they turn the file rather than going straight across. They turn it a little bit. And just having a little bit in there tends to clean it up, clean the cut up and give you a smoother cut. Yeah, I don't do that for mine. But some people really like that hybrid file in there. So yeah. But if you want to see it, I have an entire video dedicated to how do you sharpen dovetail saws. Got enough time for a couple more?
I got 3 more I pulled out.
Okay, let's hit those 3.
So Kenny-Anjanette Horn asked, what is a good vintage saw set, such as Stanley, Distton, numbers?
If it's vintage, it's probably good.
Okay.
Yeah, those are one of the things that there are so many different brands out there that made really good saw sets. Listing them off is impossible. And I really haven't come across any bad ones. I mean, if they look like a standard saw set, they were probably a good saw set, because really all it is a tiny little hammer pushing a piece of metal. They're not complicated things, and it's kind of hard to make a bad one. The biggest question is ergonomics. Do you want one that's like a gent saw, or do you want one that's like a gun pistol grip? And so, and even with that, there's a bunch of other styles that are even different from, inline and out of line. So, don't worry about brand. They're generally so cheap that if you get a couple of them, that What's next?
All right, let's see. Harold Schultz had asked, what is an affordable saw for ripping boards for cabinet woodworking?
It depends on how detailed you want your ripping to be. I mean, if I'm ripping down material and getting rough stock to size, I'm going to be using a good handsaw. PAX actually makes, there's a wide range of quality saws. If you go to a big box store, you will not find a rip saw. They're all crosscut. Finding a rip saw is very difficult. Next price bump and quality, I'm actually going to go with PAX. I really like their saws. I have a link to them in the suggested tools. There's a link to that in the description down below, as well as on my website. And I have several panel saws, hand saws, and those that I really like. Actually, I've got some over here. I want to do a video doing some demonstrations with some of theirs. And price per quality, I think they're about the best that you're going to get. Then you start moving up. Florida Toolworks, not Florida. Oh, it's going to bug me. He makes really, really cool saws. Floor something. He's probably the next bump up, and you're going to spend a little more money. You're going to get a little better quality. He makes pretty good production saws. And then after that, you have Veritas. Well, Veritas is a little less comfortable and a little bit cheaper. So I think I'd put Veritas a little before Florida. That's bugging me. What's his name? Florida Toolworks. Floor something. Yeah. And then after that, then you start getting into all the details like your Blackburn and your Bad Axe. What's that?
Florup?
Florup. There we are. Yeah. I have a problem with names. But price per quality, PAX is usually where I'm going to go. In all honesty, with a saw, the steel you get from any saw out there, if it's the big box store to the really high-end good saw, they're all made out of pretty much the exact same stuff. And the little detail between any of the saws, the steel is good enough. Steel does not really matter when it comes to the saw. The tooth geometry and the shaping of it really just depends on who last sharpened it. If you paid someone to sharpen it, then hopefully they know what they're doing. But I mean, that's how well does the saw cut is how well were the teeth cut. And so if you're going to be sharpening it, it doesn't really matter who last sharpened it because you're going to be the one doing it. The most important thing to me is the handle. How comfortable is it? How does it make you feel? How does it interact with the saw? And so that's where I'm really going to be spending my time and money focusing on the handle. Got one more?
Two.
Okay,
one to two. Let's see. Perez Hernandez asked, I forgot I have a mic there. Is there any good newly made saw sets out there? If not, what vintage saw set is good for the money? I don't know if
we already talked about that.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, last question. Harold Golden asked, before filing the points, do you joint the saw and do you try to breast a handsaw?
Breast a handsaw?
I have no idea.
I don't know what he means by that, but yes, joint the teeth first. I didn't really get into the exact how-tos of sharpening because I have entire videos where I go into those in deep detail. But yeah, joint the saws, get a nice flat, joint the teeth so you have a flat spot on all of them, and then you sharpen down to that flat spot so you know that the last thing on there was originally a piece of the flat spot, so you still have a sharp spot that has all the same height on all the teeth. But yeah, I'll go into that a lot more on the how to sharpen handsaw videos. So, this was a lot of fun. I hope you guys like the new setup here, switching back and forth. I've been enjoying this, and I've got a few other ideas for putting the overhead camera in there and some other ideas. So if you have anything you'd like to see, or you like the audio, please let me know because we're constantly trying to tweak it and make it better. But I'm going to go back and listen to it myself. So, yeah, I think that's about it. Do you have any questions? Anything I'm forgetting? Cool. So until next time, have a wonderful day.
Bye.
I'm holding.
Okay.
Cool.